Good afternoon, members of the media, and thank you for joining us. Today we'll be discussing the airport redevelopment project and the misleading statements, fabrications, half-truths, and just lies that have been told over the past 20 months by the Minister of Finance. I will take the opportunity to clarify some of these items for the people of Bermuda and also speak about how the Progressive Labor Party will handle the issue of the airport redevelopment project going forward. There has never been a question that Bermuda needs to do something about our existing airport. Whether we renovate the existing structure or build a new one, the paramount question should be, what can we as a country afford? Last week, Monday, the People's Campaign released a report entitled, A Bad Deal for Bermuda. This report contained new revelations which to date have not been discussed or examined by the local media. I encourage all members of the public to read this report and become more informed about the background of this deal. Some of the most damning revelations that have come from the document show that from the very beginning, the Minister of Finance has been misleading the people of Bermuda. And they make it clear, without a shadow of a doubt, that the Minister withheld critical information from Parliament and the Accountant General, who is responsible for ensuring that financial instructions are followed. The documents show that the Minister's own partners, the Canadian Commercial Corporation, did not agree with the statements Minister Richards has made to the people of Bermuda and did not believe they were accurate. In fact, they requested he change his statements, and the Minister largely ignored their requests. Those same items that CCC stated are not accurate, the Minister continues to repeat to this day, especially the statement that the new airport will pay for itself. From the very beginning, it has been known that Bermuda will have to put up a significant amount of funding for this deal, but the Minister and the One Bermuda Alliance continue to ignore this reality. The Minister of Finance seems to be obsessed with plans that were produced in 2006, which were part of the airport master plan, which the Minister is still using to this very day. Focusing on these old drawings is a convenient way for the Minister to ignore the real value for money questions about this billion-dollar sole source deal with Aecon, which were reiterated by the Chamber of Commerce yesterday. Referring to drawings produced 10 years ago does nothing to answer the critical questions about the current deal. The lack of tendering, the lack of transparency, and the fact that Aecon has not had to compete with anyone, and therefore we cannot be assured this deal is the best deal that Bermuda can get. Let me read a quote from the Chamber of Commerce release yesterday in which they said, and I quote, "In addition to providing transparency, a proper request for proposal process creates competitive pressures on a bidder's proposed price. A competitive RFP would drive value for money and ensure that Bermuda gets the best deal." End quote. We couldn't agree more, as this is something that we have been saying since 2014, when this project was first announced. Additionally, the Minister of Finance continues to compare the airport project to the new acute care wing, seemingly forgetting the fact that the acute care wing was put out to tender. There is one other key difference. The Bermuda government runs our hospital and not a private company, as will be the case with Aecon and our existing and new airport terminal if this deal goes through. The latest PR move by the Minister to try and make this deal better than it sounds is he talks about profit sharing. The OBA have even gone so far as to create a website that states that the profit sharing from this deal will free up money for seniors and for schools. It seems the OBA has no issue lying to the people of Bermuda. The Minister of Finance is on record of stating that any profit sharing from the airport is at least 15 years away and will likely not happen until 20 to 25 years into the project. What will happen to our schools and seniors in the 25 years between now and then? This shameful PR exercise is a reason why there is a vast trust deficit between the OBA and the people of Bermuda. What we should ask ourselves is if the OBA would use our children as pawns for their lives, why should we trust them with our children's future? The fact that the OBA is dishonest should not come as a surprise. But I would like to speak to how the PLP will handle the airport project going forward. First, Minister Richards wants to create the impression that this is a done deal. It is not, and there are many steps that need to be completed before this project can get approval to proceed. The letter of entrustment requires the government to produce a written and evidence-based assessment, which, amongst other items, will contain the public sector comparator. This has been required by the United Kingdom in order to progress this project. This comparator will show, side by side, the cost to the people of Bermuda of this project if the government were to fund it itself, or if we were to privatize our airport to Aecon. After this document is produced, we call on the international business community, who privately have expressed their dismay at the direction that the One Bermuda Alliance have taken with this project, to examine the numbers and to ensure that the minister hasn't fuzzied them up. It is important as the financial hole that this airport privatization will create in our budget will likely have to be filled by increased taxes to the private sector. The PLP awaits this document, and until the time it is released, we will continue to educate the people of Bermuda on this deal, which will award a sole source contract valued at well over $1 billion to a Canadian company that will get free electricity courtesy of the people of Bermuda and earned a taxpayer guaranteed return of 16%.
Good afternoon. The need to renovate or rebuild our airport is undisputed. This has never been a question. However, the need to privatize airport operations, deceive the public, and operate under a veil of secrecy as a means of achieving this is where the problem arises. Since March 2014, when I tabled a motion calling for the creation of an airport authority, the PLP has sought to provide a more transparent process for improving and managing our facility. This authority would have provided the framework by which we are able to safeguard our assets, properly tender projects, and at the end have an airport which would not become an indirect financial burden to the next generation. Simply put, we have always said we must build something that we can afford in a way that meets the standards of good governance, as we are realizing more and more that the project, as proposed by the OBA, falls short of these goals. With a cost of $250 million, this proposed redevelopment is not something that we can afford. Despite this, it has become a major priority for Minister Richards and clearly is held in a higher regard than the more pressing domestic issues we face. Surely, with a failing education system and a majority of schools older than the airport itself, many believe we should focus our attention and better share our resources amongst other pressing needs. The constant dismissal of concerns and the line that we do not know what we're doing or what we're talking about being used by the OBA and Minister Richards has become ineffective. And the people of Bermuda are now becoming more and more aware of the facts that the documents from the Canadian government prove we have been and have always been spot on all along. If you are against this deal, like the majority of the population, I am here to tell you what is coming down the pipeline. This is nowhere near a done deal. The government still faces a few major hurdles. One which my colleague has already discussed, and the second, which is a legislative matter. According to the airport agreement, Section 6 and 7 to be specific, the government plans to deregulate the setting and collecting of fees. For example, landing fees, airport improvement taxes, and the like, and give this authority to Project Co, which we must keep in mind can only be controlled and or operated by Aecon. Achieving this will require the government to table legislation and pass it through both houses of Parliament. This will provide us with a last chance to deny the OBA the opportunity to move forward with this deal. If we do not, we will find ourselves with Aecon giving and setting revenue guarantees for airlines. Other jurisdictions have been able to build airports that better meet their needs at a fraction of the cost that Minister of Finance Bob Richards has quoted us. Our opinion is that Bermuda too can achieve its goal in respect to the airport without giving away operational control of both this country's physical and economic gateway to a company that decided this deal should have taken place in the first place. As we have many times before, we caution Minister Richards and the Dunkley administration in moving forward with this deal and encourage a more transparent process for redevelopment might be managed through an apolitical authority to achieve the greatest outcome for the lowest possible cost.
Well, Brian, there's a lot of different things that that the government has to produce, and there is a long list of items of gaps that were identified in the Deloitte report that the government has to address. Yes, there's an independent valuation that has to be done, but as the Chamber of Commerce stated, the best way to make sure that we get the best deal is through a public RFP process. What also has to be produced is what has been required by the United Kingdom, which is very important, which is a public sector comparator. We've heard a lot of talk about, whether or not if the government to borrow the money itself or whether a private company should borrow the money. When we have a public sector comparator, which is something that is supposed to be done before you go down the road. It's one of those things that you do first, not afterwards, but the United Kingdom is requiring it to be done. You look at the two options and say, if the government were to borrow the money and manage the project and retain operational control of the airport, or if we were to privatize it, what would be the net effect to the government's balance sheet and the government's budget? And I think that's the most important point, because I can promise you that the government does not borrow money at 16%, yet we are guaranteeing Aecon a 16% internal rate of return on their project. We've just revealed and spoken about the fact that the Canadian Commercial Corporation did not agree with the statements that Minister Richards has made, and we think that it's kind of interesting that the Minister of Finance himself has largely ignored the concerns which have been raised by the People's Campaign and going back to harking on designs that were done 10 years ago. What we are making sure as we put forward is the steps that take place going forward into the future about the public sector comparator and making sure that we call on international business, the people who will be paying for this hole that will be created in our budget, to examine these figures to make sure that Bermuda is going to get the best deal.
Also, what we have done is today, what we did discuss is the way forward. That if you were to listen to the government, if you were to listen to Minister Richards, you would believe that this is a done deal and that it cannot be stopped. What we are saying is that there are a couple major hurdles that the government has to get over, and one of them is when they have to bring it back to Parliament. So therefore, and that is where we have our last stand, because without it coming to Parliament, without it getting passed through Parliament, Aecon cannot and will not get paid. The minister's actions, he goes through the formality of saying that it's not a done deal, and the only reason he's now saying it's not a done deal is because Steve Nakin from Aecon came out and said it was not a done deal. Other than that, he had gone through and he had made the public and the people, left them with the impression that there was nothing that could stop this deal from going through and that it was an eventuality. What we are trying to say is that that is not the case, and that there are ways that we can stop this in Parliament and to let the people know what is going on and what is going to come down the pipelines, because we can see that the government tells people after the fact. We are letting people know before it happens, like we have since 2014.
Well, there's two separate items. The first item is, and I think that it's very important, and this is a point that we have to make crystal clear, because a lot of time in the community, it's been said, if the PLP is returned to government, will you cancel this airport deal? The fact is that we've already seen the repercussions that happen on the public when governments cancel contracts which have already been signed. We saw what happened when the government canceled the waterfront contract. We saw that that in addition to the fact that it lowered our rule of law ratings around the world, which also led on to further actions such as debt downgrades, the government is embroiled still in a legal battle over such issues. So it would not be responsible of the Progressive Labour Party government or the Progressive Labour Party opposition or for future Progressive Labour Party government to say that we would be able to cancel the deal. There's a lot of steps that need to go forward before that. What we will do, however, and what we have stated publicly is it was our preference to examine the renovation and extension of life of the existing facility up to a point where we can invest additional money into our tourism product to raise the level of air arrivals so that we are better suited to pay for an airport development. However, what is more important is that if the Progressive Labour Party were to become government tomorrow, what we would commit to do is by making sure that AECON would have to compete, and we would put this project out to a Swiss challenge, which would mean that other companies would be able to come in and bid and to see if they can beat AECON's price. This is the exact same thing that AECON had to do in the last airport that they built in Quito, Ecuador, and we think that it is something that will ensure the concerns for value for money are met inside of this project.
And also, from an operational point of view, what we would do is we would create an airport authority first. So therefore, the companies that are bidding, when they go to the Swiss Challenge, would have to go through the airport authority. The airport authority would at all times maintain operational control of the airport, which meant that Bermuda and the Bermudian people would maintain operational and also financial control of the airport. So therefore, when AECON went to go to the Swiss Challenge, they would be submitting it to the airport authority, not the other way around. So this way, we can maintain control of both our economic and physical gateway at all times for the next 30 years, while not giving away $1.6 billion in revenue.
We heard from another reporter that the minister is saying that this is not a done deal. However, the actions of the minister make it seem as though this is a done deal. When we're talking about producing plans and all the rest and stating we're going to break ground without critical steps that have to take place. What the public can do is that we have to make sure that we follow and enjoy the democratic process. And that means making sure that the members of parliament who represent you in your areas, knowing that an election is coming up, are clear as to where you stand in regards to this airport development project and this airport development deal. There are members of parliament from the One Bermuda Alliance who now do not control the majority of parliament who will have to face a question. The question is whether or not they want to vote for an airport deal, which will give free electricity and a guaranteed 16% taxpayer guaranteed return to a company, or face their voters when making that decision. And that's what they have to ask. They have to ask themselves whether or not loyalty to Minister Bob Richards is more important than representing the views of their constituents that they have to face in an election next year. We've heard privately through not only members of the Chamber of Commerce, but also members of the international business community on many different levels, and these are persons who do not traditionally support the Progressive Labour Party, that they are dismayed with the way that this project is going forward. And when I speak to members of the international business community, I would say, would you ever go forward with $1 billion deal before examining the various alternatives? Would you ever lock yourself into something for 30 years before looking at what the alternatives may be, before seeing whether or not you can do something better and more effectively? I mean, when you look at the documents for the People's Campaign, it's as though if this figure of $250 million was the starting point. The money was the starting point, as opposed to figuring out what can the country actually afford and looking to make sure that we can do plans or build a structure that is in line with what we can afford. And that's the reason why so many questions are being asked. And I think it's a very key point that we have to note. The minister's own fiscal responsibility panel stated that this has to be viewed as an expense. It is not going to pay for itself. And if it is going to be viewed as an expense, that means that the government is either going to have to borrow money to make up for the difference in its annual budgets, or it's going to have to cut back services or raise taxes. If the taxes are raised, then that means that the businesses and the people of this country are going to bear the burden. And that's why it's important for the international business community to make sure that they examine the documents that are produced to make clear that this project actually represents the best value for money that we have. It would have been ideal for this project to have been tendered first, so we would have been able to have a clear process like we did at the new acute care wing for the hospital, but we don't. So we are stuck trying to make the best that we can make out of the mess that Minister Bob Richards has made.
And if you look at our competitors to the south, if you look at Bahamas, who has a bigger airport, you look at Cayman Islands, which has a very similar size airport, and their redevelopment projects, we are multiple times more expensive. We actually would be, if this project was to go through as it is, would be the most expensive airport redevelopment project per foot within the Caribbean. And we are not one of the biggest airports. This would be one of the smaller airports. So if memory serves me correctly, the Cayman Islands came in at approximately $70 million. But yet we are spending $250 million for a renovation size of approximately the same size, bid on by the same company that wanted to do the Cayman Islands, but was also rejected by the UK government. So right now, there is no value for money that can be justified in this current state. And this is why you probably see those members in the international business community and the Chamber of Commerce voicing their concerns and dismay of the current state of this project. Once again, for us, we would actually, going through the creation of an airport authority first, that would allow the airport authority to talk to Bermuda Tourism Authority to look at the projected figures. If we were to look at the last 5 years just as a staple for our tourist arrivals, and then take the $16 per person, you roughly have about 227,000 people per year. You times that by 5, and that is approximately where you would get just what we could approximately afford when it comes to airport redevelopment or an upgrade. We don't have an estimate on the square foot because we don't know exactly what we can afford right now based off of tourism arrivals and what fees are going on.
What I would say is that from the square footage size of the current airport and the estimated price tag for the development, when it breaks down to that amount for square foot, he might say, oh, aprons this, aprons that, all the rest. The fact of the matter is, it's the total square footage of the building, and that's the total price of what it is. And when compared against other airports, it is more expensive. Whether or not the minister likes it, the fact is that if you're looking at a $250 million facility and you're looking at approximately 22,000 square feet, that's what it comes up to. Well,
I don't think they would have.
I'm not sure if it would be the chamber, whether it be international business community, or whether it be certain organizations inside the local media. The fact is that what we are talking about right here is a 30-year contract entered in without a tender, where the Minister of Finance at the very beginning said that there was no vendor that was selected, when we now find out from evidence that was released from the Canadian government that the minister met with this company in Canada long before he spoke to anyone here in this country. So he's gone to Parliament saying, oh, if they found out about this from reading our budget replies, when the minister's own advisors were talking to the very people. The minister has been lying from the start on this project. That is what the documents prove. He has misled the people of this country. He has misled Parliament. He has omitted information. He has misled his own accountant general. When the accountant general of the country has to write to the Minister of Finance and saying that I was unaware that a vendor was already selected, and the Minister of Finance had met with this vendor 3 months prior to asking the accountant general for the permission, what we should be asking, I think, is how is it actually possible that this minister still remains the Minister of Finance and enjoys the Premier's confidence? In any other government, in any other country, this minister would have been asked to tender his resignation immediately.
We don't know who is going to own the operational control of our airport in 30 years. Because if you look at Acorn, they went into Quito, Ecuador for, I think, 30 to 40 years. And within 5 or 10 years, they sold off their share and sold it off to 2 other consortiums. So therefore, what is saying that that's not what they're going to do for us? And then therefore, we could then end up in an even worse deal with an unrecognized company, someone who we don't know, who we don't recognize, and who we don't trust, operating our airport or having operational control. So this is why the PLP is saying create the airport authority first, just like they did in every other jurisdiction, Cayman Islands, Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, and Bahamas. So therefore, no matter what happens, you always have operational control of that airport and of your economic and physical gateway.